Welcome to all of our participants today in today's webinar. We're going to be looking at, as Emily said, inquests, and I've brought it in even a little bit more specific to 1942 to 1963, which are the inquests that are findable in our just released volunteer produced index, which we're going to talk about today. And my slides are moving forward. In the spirit of reconciliation, New South Wales State Archives acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'd like to also let the participants know that today's presentation contains details of cases heard by the Coroner's Court, and this content may be disturbing to some participants, so please keep that in mind as we move through the content. I will try to give you warnings as we move into different areas, but it's just something to be aware of, not only in this presentation, but also when you're accessing these files. So a quick outline of today's webinar. We're going to take a look at the role of the coroner. We're going to have a look at how you know if an inquest was held. We're going to have a look at how you can find inquests for the period 1942-1960. And then we're going to have a dive into some examples of what inquest papers look like and what you can expect if you find a file relating to a person of interest. So, a great place to start, I think, is to understand what the role of the coroner was. And what I've done is just pulled out a description from the official yearbook of New South Wales, 1948-49. So that's right in our specific period of interest. So what was the role of the coroner during this time? We're told that at the coroner's discretion, inquiries are held into the causes of violent or unnatural deaths, of deaths in jails or in mines, and into the origin of fires causing damage or destruction to property. So something to keep in mind, it's at the coroner's discretion for the majority of inquests. What we may find is that the coroner dispensed with an inquest if, for example, the police report was pretty clear cut. So what you might find with your people is that the inquest, if you find that the inquest was dispensed with, usually it'll be sort of a single notice of death that comes through with that. We're also told that in certain cases, a jury of 6 persons may be impaneled to find as to the facts of the case, and on their verdict against any person, he may be committed for trial. So what we may find is that this jury, a coronial jury, finds that someone should be taken to trial. Sometimes that then doesn't eventuate, but it's something to be aware of when we're looking at these files. And we're told that each stipendiary magistrate has the powers and duties of a coroner in all parts of the state. In districts not readily available to magistrates, a local resident, usually a justice of the peace, is appointed coroner. So we don't have a single coroner across the state at this period. The coroners are happening in those regions. So you'll see as we move forward different coroners' names. It's also worth keeping in mind that we do have a city coroner in the metro area. So that's the role of the coroner. So we're looking at violent or unnatural deaths, deaths in jails and mines, and also fires. Okay, so we know what the coroner was doing and what the role of the coroner was. How do you know if an inquest was held into the death of a person of interest? So one of the first places to start is with the death certificate. So the death certificate should show whether an inquest was held or if an inquest was dispensed with. And I mentioned what that was just on the previous slide. Now, how do you get hold of your death certificates? We don't hold them here. You're going to have to go and see the New South Wales Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and that's for death certificates 30 years plus. Now, you may also find a newspaper report of the inquest. So newspapers can be a really great source for finding out about whether an inquest was held. Now, we don't hold newspapers as New South Wales State Archives, but I'm sure many of our participants have used and are aware of the most excellent site trove. And I've got the link there for those of you who haven't discovered it as yet. So that's a wonderful online portal to a freely available collection of digitised newspapers. Now, you could also try the New South Wales State Library and also a public library in the local area. So it's worth keeping in mind that not all papers have been digitised. So if you find that there's gaps, those can be solutions as well. And another source, of course, is our Inquest Index, July 1942, June 1963, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. So some of you may have interest in inquest records outside of our period of interest. For further information on those records and just further information more broadly, you should go and have a look at our Inquest and Coronial Records Guide, which is on our website under Research A to Z. Now, unfortunately, only a small sample of files from 1916, 1918 to 20, and 1921 to 39 have survived. Papers for 1940 through 63 have mostly survived. So just be aware that outside the area that we're talking about today, very few papers have survived in our collection. Now, Ancestry have indexed and digitised some of our holdings of inquest records. These are mainly indexes and registers. And again, for period outside of the period of time we're talking today, generally the registers are all that have survived. So some of you may have already accessed some of those earlier records via Ancestry. Now, if you need further advice or you've got more questions, check the Inquest Guide, but you can also give us a quick a call if you've got a quick question, and our phone number is available on the website. And you can also send us an Ask an Archivist inquiry as well if you just want a little bit more guidance or advice. Okay, so how are we going to find inquest papers for the period 1942-1963? There's two options available to you, and I'm going to run through both. The first is using Collection Search, which is our main online catalogue, and the second is to go specifically into the Inquest Index. And the searching techniques are a little different across the two, and depending on your search needs, you may have a preference for either one. So please be aware that the index has been compiled from the card register to inquests, covering the period July 1942 through June 1963. So if your person's inquest was held in the first half of 1942, they're not going to appear in the index. You'll need to take another avenue to find those records, and we can give you advice and guidance on how to do that. Please note also that some of the files may not have survived. Again, this is an index compiled from the card register. So let's have a look. We're going to start with how you would find your person via collection search. And I've made my mouse big at request, so hopefully that helps with identifying what we're looking at. So to use collection search for your search, you're going to go to our home page, and I've got the address there. You can also just Google New South Wales State Archives. You're going to go to our home page. You know you're there because of this beautiful watercolour of the Harbour Bridge. And then you're going to pop your person's name into our collection search box. So I'm searching Elizabeth Kathleen Wild, typed her name in, and then I'm going to hit this search button or the red magnifying glass. Once I've done that, I'm going to get my results screen. So for Kathleen, there's actually only 2 results, so I'm not dealing with a mass of data. Any of our regular users will recognise this number here as being a probate for Kathleen, but what we're interested in today is this inquest index entry. Now, I've just got a little bit of advice for those of you who may have more common names that you're searching. You can pop over here and use the tweak my results to actually limit your search. So what you would do if you had, say, George Thompson, and you had a lot of results here, you would tweak my results. You would say entries in indexes, and you would click on the Inquest Cards Index, and then you're limiting to just those results. You could also try searching for your person's name and adding Inquest to the search. So that's another way of getting around it. Now, what you then do, you can click on the person's name, and that's going to actually give you some more details. So you're going to get additional information like district. So that can be helpful again if you're lacking information about your person. And you're also going to get the remarks column. So in this instance, we've got the remarks field there telling us the name of the coroner and where that was held. But sometimes that remarks column or remarks field can actually tell us if further action was taken in a criminal court, and that will affect the type of record that you're likely to encounter. So it can be worthwhile jumping in there and having a look at that. Now from here, the thing we're really interested in is how to access it. So you've got two ways of accessing. The little clipboard icon up here is what you're going to use to order that to the reading room. So that's when you're visiting on site, you're going to request that to the reading room. If you can't visit us or you would like to purchase a copy, you can use the little shopping cart icon. So there is a copy service associated with these files, okay? Now, if you want more advice and guidance on using collection search and how to do either of those things, we've got a guide online. And again, you can always get in touch with us. So the other way of searching for these is our online index. And to find that, you're going to go back to our home page, and under quick links, you're going to click on online indexes. You're going to get this alphabet along the top, and you're going to select I for inquests. And from there, you're going to get these two indexes. We're interested in the inquest index. And from here, you can either click search the index and you'll be taken straight through to the search screen, or you can click on more about the index, and that'll actually give you information about the type of information contained in the index, where it's come from, for example, the card register, and whether or not a copy service is available. So that's something to keep in mind even more broadly as you use our collection. So we're going to go into the Inquest card index search. You can see that we've got our search box here, and we can search by name, we can search by inquest number if we had it, and we can also search by keyword. So if we were looking for example, all the fire files, or we were looking for a particular area, we might like to do a search there. For those of you wanting to construct maybe a larger data set, maybe you're interested in the records more broadly, be aware that you can do that here. So you can actually drop this down to show up to 500 entries. You can also export your results. So if you were chasing a particular name or period, you might want to create a data set and then export that, and you can do that in a variety of formats. Also, if you click on the details, you're going to be taken through to that further details screen where you can either purchase a copy or request a reading room. And we've also got just some advice there on searching for your people. So I know all of you out there are excellent searchers and you're very used to using these wildcards, but they can be incredibly useful if your person has, say, unusual spelling, or a name is often misspelled, you know, they leave out a U or an O or something like that. It can just help. And remember, of course, that humans are involved in this along the way. So, you know, in creating the card, in transcribing the card, all of that kind of stuff. So those are our tips for finding inquests. What I've got here are two quotes, I think, that I hope just impress you with how valuable these records are and why I think they're so important to family history, to social history, to how we understand ourselves in New South Wales. So the first quote there is, "Inquests are most fantastic, the most granular, the most tragic, the most historically insightful, because the way in which people die is a fascinating way to explore how people lived." And the second quote is, "The inquest itself was a fact-finding investigation rather than a trial, an inquisitorial rather than an accusatorial procedure." And because of the nature of inquests, we do get an awful amount of information about how a person lived prior to their death. And we also get individual, ordinary people living ordinary lives can become moments of change in death. You know, they can enact legislative change so that these type of accidents or deaths don't occur again. So incredibly important files, and I hope as we move through some of the examples that you feel that way too. So let's have a look at our first example here. So I'm giving you an example there of what it looks like in our system when you are searching. We're looking at the inquest file of Dudley Robert Blackstock. So you can see there the date is 1960 and we're in Condobolin. And Dudley Robert Blackstock was a linesman who died suddenly on the job. Now, in the inquest files, the depositions, so the statements from people surrounding this person, are incredibly important. So you're getting lots of written statements in your inquest file from a variety of people. So it's not just one person who knew them, it's a variety of people. So the first deposition that you can see here, we're told it's by Donald Sloan, and he introduces himself as the Constable of Police, and he tells us how the day played out. So he went to the shearer's quarters and had a look at the room that was occupied by the deceased Dudley and his two workmates, Leslie Parker and Edward Ward. He notes that the interior of the room were in normal condition, no signs of a struggle having taken place, and the 3 beds in the room appeared to have been recently slept in. I made an examination of the room and immediate proximity, and I found nothing of a poisonous nature. The constable is questioned. Did you notice telephone equipment lying around the quarters? I did. And did you see cat head in the area where the equipment was lying? The area around the quarters was a mass of cat head. Now, cat head is like a bird spreading weed. And so what we've got here is the constable saying, I've arrived, there was no sign of a struggle in the room, it just, it looks like where they've been sleeping. And what I did notice though is that telephone equipment that these linesmen are using is lying around, and there's this weed, there's this burr weed. And that's going to become really important as we move through the other depositions. So we've got another deposition here. This is Edward Thomas Ward, and as we know, he's a colleague or a workmate of the deceased. And he talks about here, and again, you get a lot of information about how these people lived prior to their deaths. So he says there, I took up residence at the shearer's quarters. The 3 of us were engaged in telephone line work in the area. We would work in the area from Monday to Friday and return home at the weekend. And he talks about the day of the death. So on Tuesday, the deceased Parker and myself finished work and returned to our quarters at 5:45 p.m. The deceased cooked dinner that night, and we all partook of a meal at about 7:30 p.m. So that's interesting. We all ate the same food. So that couldn't have been poisoned, because otherwise we'd all be sick. Parker and myself commenced playing cards, and the deceased laid down on his bed. Parker said to the deceased, come here and I will teach you how to play crib. And the deceased said, no, I will have a lie down and read the paper. And whilst we were playing cards, the deceased got up and looked at a leg of mutton he was cooking. Parker and myself finished playing cards at 8:45 p.m. The 3 of us then had a drink of quick. That is a chocolate drink, and we all retired to bed. So you've got this, this detail of the night. The 2 workmates wake up to his heavy breathing. Sorry, I'm just going to take us back. And we can see a description here. And Parker and his workmate, they get up and Parker said to me, I don't like the look of him. I will go and get a doctor. He then went away and returned a short while. One of us had better go and bring the doctor out. I said to him, you are more experienced in first aid than I am. You wait here and I'll go and get the doctor. Now, this deponent is also questioned. So again, just, tell us, was it necessary for you to handle copper wire? Yes. And in that same period, do you know if the deceased received any cuts or scratches from handling the copper wire? We all did. Did you see any cuts or scratches on the deceased? I saw scratches on the position of the knuckle and forefinger on each hand. In that period you worked, between Monday and Friday inclusive. That is right. Did you all return together to Trundle, or by one car or in 2 cars? We all returned in the 1 car. And whilst returning, did the car have any accident? No. And did you notice whether it would be possible in that period for the deceased whilst returning to receive any cuts or bruises? None at all. So we're given here, nothing in the last week's happened that might have contributed. There's been no accident. We're also told here, prior to the night, the deceased seemed to be in good health and there was no evidence of it being ill. So it suggests nothing, no previous illness. We move forward here. Did the deceased handle telephone equipment where the cat head was? Yes. Did you know if the deceased picked up any cat head in his hand? And if so, what did he say? The deceased said to me, Jesus Christ, these bloody cat heads. And then over here, another deponent, we are told, this is a doctor, and he's asked about whether, sorry about that, whether cat head can carry tetanus. And we're told, yes, it can. Cat head could be impregnated with tetanus germ, yes. And so the coronial finding is that Dudley died from natural causes, tetanus, and we can see it's through handling those lines on top of the cat head. Now, as I mentioned, inquest files can be that point of change. So this is an example of Marjorie Harriet Davey, who passed away as an accidental death after receiving a shock through the faulty connection to an iron. The switch had been turned off, but power was still flowing to the iron as a result of faulty installation. So she's attempted to fix the iron. So what we get on the front of this inquest here is the depositions in relation to the coroners have actually been made available to the Department of Local Government and the Electricity Authority because of the findings that were made and the recommendations that came out of it. So we've got two depositions here. The first that I want us to have a look at is this deposition here, which is by Ruth Mary Davey. She's a school teacher, but she's also the sister of the deceased. And she talks about entering the house and finding her sister. And I want to just have a look at the things that she notices compared to our second deponent that we'll look at in a moment. So she says, I noticed an ironing blanket on the table when I entered the kitchen. The electric iron was also there. It was flat on the table. I did not touch the iron. I noticed that the sheet was scorched where the iron was standing. There were clothes on the table which had been ironed. The iron was hot. There would have been sufficient heat in the iron when she saw it to continue with the ironing. And she notices the flexible cord. She notices that the power point is switched off. So all of these things, I think, associated, you know, when you yourself have undertaken a task, you're very aware of those elements associated with the task. So the hot ironing, the ironing blanket, there's clothes that have already been done. It all points to the iron having been in use. She also notices that she's shown this screwdriver, which becomes key. And she says, I have known my sister to attempt repairs to the ironing cord. If it was necessary to use a screwdriver, the one produced would be the one that she would use. And we're also noted that she enjoyed good health up to the time of her death. Now, this other deponent that we have over here, oh, it keeps doing that, is Clifford Gordon Wyboard, and we're told that he's an electrician employed by the council. Now, he comes in, and of course, the things that he notices are quite different. So he walks in and notices the iron and sees the flexible cord, which he examines. He also notes that even though the power switch is in and off position, the power has not been cut off because of a wrong conductor. He examines the flexible cord and sees that there's an issue with it, that there's something broken. And he also notes that when Marjorie was removed, there was a screwdriver found underneath her. He says that it would be possible to receive an electric shock from the iron plug while it was in the off position while using a metal screwdriver. Now, importantly, what we're also told here, because the idea is to understand how the death occurred. And of course, if we can prevent these in the future, that's really important. So he says here that a new switch had been affixed after the council inspection. It would be somewhere around 20 to 22 years since the installation was tested. Periodical inspections were started by the council just prior to the war, but during the war, the inspections were stopped owing to labour and material shortages. I have no idea when the inspections will be started again. And so what we find is the coroner makes a recommendation that inspections by councilmen which were discontinued because of a lack of labour and materials should be started as soon as possible, and installations carried out by private contractors should be inspected by the council. So you can see here the power, I think, of the depositions and the findings that come through. Now, this example here of the death of Aubrey Elva Cable, remember how I mentioned in the entry that you get this remarks column here that tells us papers, in this case, papers to the clerk of the peace, William Joseph Cable committed for trial at Central Criminal Court for murder. Now, because the papers associated with the inquest have gone to the clerk of the peace, all we find in Audrey's file is this single finding document, which is the findings of the coroner, which is that she died from poisoning, and it was feloniously and maliciously administered, and he is pointing towards William Joseph Cable as the person who did that. So the file contains just this single document. All other records have gone now into Supreme Court records. Those records are subject to a different access direction. So Supreme Court records are closed for 75 years. So in this instance, we would not be able to access the Supreme Court records. So to find out more, we can go to the newspapers. So this was widely reported. William Joseph Cable did go to trial and was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. So just keep that in mind as well as we're moving through. You might encounter some blocks where, for example, there's a murder trial. So we've got another a little bit different here. So this is an example of a fire that occurred, and the reason why I've included this is to show you something else, but also just to show you how powerful these can be in terms of locating like local history information. They can be incredibly rich, and I'm just going to read you a little bit. One of my favorite depositions from Stanley. I mean, there's so many, but this is quite colourful, from the Constable of Police, and also just talk a little bit about what more broadly in terms of our local history we can gain from these files. So the Constable of Police gives the following deposition. At about 3 a.m. on the 31st of July, 55, a Sunday morning, I was awakened by a telephone call from George Leonard Trouncin, the town bushfire captain, and he informed me that the public hall was on fire. I left the police residence immediately, and on running up the street saw Mrs. Brown, the wife of the licensee, leaning on the balcony of the hotel, and I shouted to her, "Wake the boarders up and get them to form a bucket brigade." I went to the public hall on the southern side, which is in Margaret Street, and saw that portion of the hall in the vicinity of the main doors was blazing fiercely and had caught the walls to about a height of about 8 or 9 feet. I ran to the rear of the hall to the projection box, where I saw Keith and John Hope and Peter Powderly. These 3 men were removing equipment and films from the projection room. With Keith Hope, I busted in the rear door of the hall in an attempt to obtain 2 large fire extinguishers from the hall, but we had to give this up on account of the dense smoke. In coming out of the hall, I knocked the door, which swung shut, locking Keith Hope in the burning hall. When I discovered this, I kicked the door in and released him. By this time, a number of people had arrived with buckets, and we started to throw water on the burning portion of the hall. The fire was brought under control about 4 a.m. and finally extinguished about 4:20. So, rich detail. I mean, we're standing there, right? We can feel how fiercely this is, and that moment when Keith is locked in the burning hall. Really, really lovely detail coming through in the depositions. But as we read through more of them, we can really start to construct what this town, the members of the town and their roles in the town during this period. So I've just pulled, a few of these names. So we've got John Dudley Hope, who's a motor mechanic and also the son of Stuart Hope, who's the manager of the theatre. We can see that the Trouncin, and I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, have a connection to the Public Hall Committee, which is quite interesting because, of course, the Public Hall Committee has an interest in the insurance, and so they're questioned about who might benefit from a insurance payout. So you can see how we've constructed a really interesting little network of people connected to each other in this town. So for those of you interested in your local history, might be worthwhile just checking out some of the fire files to see if you can pull some of that detail about, people, we get in depth, some of the depositions talk about people who lived closer to particular events, so it just gives you some really nice detail all round. We're going to have another look at here. So what we focused on there is the depositions, which are the statements of people. What we also find in some files, no guarantee, but in some files we also find some of the exhibits have been maintained. These can be incredibly moving. I haven't included it in here, but I did come across an incredible, so I'm not going to mention his name because he specifically requests that it not be, but the person was found deceased in a park and had left 2 notes that the person had taken their own life. And one of the notes, he apologizes for what he has done and asks that his clothes be given to so this is during wartime, given to a fund that for people affected by the war in Britain. And the second note is to the police, again apologising and asking that his name be kept out of the papers. And so I didn't want to pop him in here because of that request. But you know, those 2 notes are in his hand, you know, written in his hand moments before he took his own life, and that can be incredibly affecting. So I want you to just be aware of that as you access the files, that you may encounter that kind of material, and you may not know how it will impact you. So just be aware of the trauma that might be associated with accessing some of these, and that's what we're going to look at in the next few slides. So this is an example from Gordon Bickland, who was a 23-year-old dentist and flight lieutenant in the RAF. And he died of what was found to be an accidental overdose of sleeping pills in a hotel room. Now, what was tendered as evidence in his coronial inquest was his diary. And you can see that here, diary tendered and marked Exhibit 3. The person tendering it says, I endeavoured to contact the persons referred to by the deceased in that diary without result. The diary has not been fully kept. The last entries in the diary are from the 8th to the 13th of August 1943. Gordon passed away on the 15th of August. This deponent has said, I am unable to contact or identify the persons referred to as Duke or Jen, and I'm going to show you those entries in a minute. I have been assisted by relatives, members of the RAF and dentists, but none could give me any information as to the identity of those 2 persons. I have been through the entries, and there is no reference there to any intention on the part of the deceased to take his own life. So again, that evidence contributing to the finding that this was accidental. In this particular case, we do get lots of information, sort of background information on Gordon, of the people he had interactions with and how bright he was as a person. So in the file, we get a record of exhibits, and you can see they're numbered down here. We get a description of what they are, and then in whose custody or how disposed of. So we're told that all of these pieces of evidence are actually attached to the depositions. Now, our diary is number 3, Diary of the Deceased. This is the cover. So it's just one of those really standard diaries from the period. We get an entry in Gordon's hand on New Year's Day, 1943, and he tells us that he's in camp for both Christmas and New Year. He talks about the New Year's Eve party and the time that he got to bed, and he says that it's not as good as Christmas. And then he spends New Year's Day sunbaking, like so many of us, and remarks here that he was pretty burnt and he was in bed at 11:30. I think that says tired, but I could be wrong. These are the last 2 entries. So as I said, he passed away on the 15th. So the last 2 entries in his diary. On the 12th, he writes, well, I leave tomorrow for Sydney. I hope the poor kid can take it. It's hard enough for me. And on the 13th, he writes, Duke rang up at lunchtime. His voice sounded queer. He just laughed and rang up. I don't like it. I'll see Jen first thing tomorrow. So as we saw, they weren't able to track down those 2 people. Duke is mentioned throughout the diary. We also find, again, as exhibits, photographs in the files, and they can be, again, a warning to you as a user of the file. Some of the time they can be quite confronting. So they can contain images of deceased people, and you also get photographs of the scene. So in this instance, what I'm going to show you next is a car accident. So it's just a photograph of the car as we might see on the news today. In terms of using them, be aware that you will get this record of exhibits that tells you a description of what is coming up, and you can also match the exhibits to the statements in the deposition. So it will say, exhibit 3. I had a case where there were images that I decided that I did not want to view, and I was able to use the record of exhibits and also the deposition to make that informed choice. So just be aware of that when you're again accessing these records. So I'm about to show you some images of a car accident that occurred in 1949. So a series of images are included in the file. So, they're ascertaining, conditions, what the road was like, how did this accident happen? We have a 17-year-old driver. He's employed by council, so he's got quite extensive experience. Essentially, wet road, poor brakes. He swerves to avoid some kids in a billy cart and runs into a pedestrian. So just comparing that street to how it exists today, you can see that those power poles have been replaced by trees. The buildings are quite similar though, just to give you an idea. And we also get a map in there. So this gives us details of where the accident occurred. We get our through roads, a description of the type of we've got residences next to warehouses, next to a factory, we've got shops. So again, really placing us in that time and space. We're given a location of the power poles and also the location of lighting as well. So again, that sense of place coming through in these. So that again is a record of evidence. We also have other sort of ephemeral material that can come through. So this is a case of murder-suicide. The evidence is usually evidence like this, letters, photographs, are often contained in these sort of brown paper envelopes, and they'll say exhibits and give you the number of what you're looking at. In this case, the two deceased actually had tickets to the theatre for the night that the murder-suicide occurred, and these tickets were in this little envelope, again placing us in that war context, so play safe, insure against war damage, in one of the deceased hat. So they're tendered as exhibits. And we also get a number of letters. So in this case, this is a letter that someone, a friend, sent to one of the victims, and it was found in her handbag, and seems to have been, the suggestion is it was one of the provocations for the events that occurred. So it's again giving us that, military forces passed by censor. My dearest Belle, your letter arrived yesterday. It came as quickly as mine did to you. We've got another letter here. This one is from the husband, and you can see that they underline or asterisk key points of the particular letters. So frankly, I'm very disappointed and had great hopes in being able to straighten out our problems. And he goes on, and a final letter that says, tonight you said that it is better that we not see each other again as it is impossible for us, and it moves forward. So you do get these very visceral handwritten items as well. Now I'm just going to conclude with something that's not, that's a little different and not something that I expected to find. You can see there in our record of exhibits, treasure trove. And in the description of the exhibits, we've got a number of gold sovereigns. Now, those weren't in the packet, so I didn't get to open an envelope and have those shiny coins come out. They've been disposed of otherwise. But this is a really interesting inquest for the coroner to deal with. So we're looking at a treasure trove. And I'm just going to start you with the deposition that we get from Walter Lyle Patterson, who is an inspector of buildings for the Department of Interior. So on or around 11 a.m. on the 29th of January 1946, I was making an examination of the buildings at the quarantine station, North Head, Manly, for white ants and borers. I went to a disused dormitory. To get beneath the floor, there were traps. That was the only way of entering the foundation, which are completely enclosed. I cut the trap in the floor and lowered myself down through the hole. I had an electric light with a long lead. I then moved along under the floors. I fell in some rabbit warrens, and then I fell the second time and supported myself by placing my hand on the wall. And as I raised myself out of the hole, I saw one sovereign lying on the recess in the foundations. Just amazing stuff. The recess was approximately 5 feet from ground level. Immediately after taking the coins from the ledge, I sifted through the sandy soil. I think I found 50 odd on the ledge and 4 more down below. And he goes on. So you could, it's that visceral experience and that just serendipity of tripping in the rabbit holes. And you can almost imagine the glint from his electric light on those coins. Incredible stuff. So we get some depositions of other people trying to work out what was happening here. So we're told that the quarantine area is subdivided into the following sections: saloon, second class, crew, hospital and staff quarters, and each section is placed out of bounds to the other. I know the building in which the sovereigns are found, the saloon area. So we've got our area of the quarantine station. We're told in another deposition that from these, saloon or first class passengers would have been accommodated in the saloon area. These are our wealthy travellers. They would not be actual patients. These would be accommodated in the hospital area, but only contacts with some other person suffering from an epidemic disease. Should a person develop an epidemic disease while staying in the saloon or other area, that person would not be permitted again to re-enter the area from which he is taken, not even on receiving a clear discharge. If a person who was a contact had deposited the coins there and had been taken to hospital, they would not be able to return to the building to recover the coins. A question: have you any record at the quarantine station of any report of any person of having lost, mislaid or reporting the theft of 60 sovereigns? Answer: no record at all. And our records go back to 1884. Now, we're also told here, importantly, that the earliest dated coin is 1864 and the most recently struck coin is 1894. So remember, this is happening in the 40s. Now, what happens? Well, the coroner invokes a law dating back to 1275, we're told in the papers, that as no claim had been made for the 60 sovereigns unearthed at the quarantine station, the coins were a treasure trove and should be handed to the New South Wales Treasury. This decision was made under common law jurisdiction dating back to 1275, giving coroners power to hold inquisitions on unclaimed treasure. The coroner recommended a reward for the finder for his honesty in immediately reporting his find. And did that play out? Yes, we're told that our honest reward finder, our treasure hunter, is given £50 reward, which is not a small reward, given that the sovereigns were worth about £150, so quite substantial. So we're going to end there. Just a couple of things to remember, and then we can have a chat. So you can use Collection Search or the online index to search for the files. That's covering the period 1942 through 1963. You can request the files to the reading room to view, or you can purchase via our copy service. And for further advice and guidance on this and other inquest and coronial records, see our guide under Research A to Z. And I think as you've seen, some of the files may contain distressing material, so just keep that in mind as you're using these and searching for your people. So I hope you've enjoyed today's webinar, and I hope that you've got a fondness for these records, you know, similar to what I have, and can see just how important they are.